in the name of personal injury law.
We're here today with Steve Sinas, a personal injury attorney at the Sinas law firm, to talk about the Michigan Wrongful Death Act and what happens when a family member dies because of someone else's wrongdoing. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about the rights of family members when a loved one dies in that context?
Absolutely. So we handle wrongful death cases at our firm. And one thing I see is that people come in not knowing much about how this process works. Some people just assume that we have this right. Maybe they almost think it's from the Constitution or whatever it may be, that we have a right to pursue an action against someone who causes the death of our loved one. Actually, the reason why we have that right is because of the statute, the Michigan Wrongful Death Act. I think all states in America have a Wrongful Death Act statute, but it took the legislature passing a bill to give these families some rights in the civil realm to pursue damages against those who caused the death of their loved one.
So what kind of damages or rights do the families have specifically? So
under the Michigan Wrongful Death Act, you can first start with the person who dies. The law provides them the right to pursue on behalf of the estate. The estate is what's opened up for the deceased person. And the estate can pursue a claim on behalf of the deceased person for pain and suffering damages that person experienced leading up to their death. Sometimes death is instantaneous. With a vehicle crash, the person might be killed instantly. Sometimes people live for several months and then die. It's in those cases where you pursue that type of pain and suffering damages on behalf of the decedent. But when there's a death, the family members have rights. Dependents, which would include spouses and children, have a right for economic damages. So if the deceased person was bringing in income and the other people were relying on it, they would be the dependents and they can claim the compensation for that loss of income. Now there's also this class of interested persons, which include the person's parents, their children, their siblings, and grandparents. All those people have a right for loss of society and companionship damages. So the Michigan Wrongful Death Law says, okay, if you fall in that class and someone dies in your family, you can pursue damages for your loss of that relationship. Those are essentially the rights under the Wrongful Death Law.
Okay, and so what is the process for pursuing one of these cases?
Well, it's not that you can just walk into court or just go ahead and pursue these rights if you're a family member. You have to go through the formal process, which begins with filing a petition in the probate court to open an estate on behalf of the deceased person. And so that's a pretty simple process, but you still have to do it. And then the court creates the estate, and that's the legal entity that is representing the interest of the deceased person. And then the court has to appoint a personal representative. Were you going to ask them?
Well, I was going to ask about what kind of deadline is there to do this?
There's a bunch of timelines, and you have to notify family members, and so none of it is intuitive, right? So you have to consult with an attorney, you got to go through the probate rules, and then the appointment of the personal representative is a very important moment where the court says, okay, this person is going to represent the interests of the estate. That's the person that has the power to act on behalf of the estate.
And this person is the personal representative of the estate of the deceased person,
right? That's right.
Okay.
And there can be fights in the probate court about who that person is. But once that person is appointed, they are the ones who have authority to pursue the wrongful death action. So it's quite a process. But once you get it going, then it can be pursued.
So what is it like to represent these families who have undergone such a sad loss to their family member?
I can tell you it's a very emotional experience. And if you're really going to do your job well as a personal injury attorney handling wrongful death claims, the experience should be one where you immerse yourself into that family, because you have all these rights to pursue, and you have this family that has been inflicted with this sudden tragedy, and you really need to connect with them, because you got to do it to do your job. You have to do it to make them feel that you actually understand, or they're trying to understand. I don't think you can ever really understand. That's one thing I've learned, is that you can always try to understand. But those who are, subject to the loss, they're going through something you can't really fully understand, but you do everything you can. And you really have to know the relationships each person had with that decedent. You got to know about the history of that family, and even before that person was born. Where do they come from? What are they about? What were their interests? And so it's a rewarding experience, but it's one that you really have to be genuine and connect with the family on.
So can you give us any examples of real life cases?
Yeah, I can think of 3 really heartbreaking cases. I mean, there's others, but I'm going to talk about these 3. Give you some quick fact patterns. A farmer, his family had been farming in the area since 1840. And one day he was on his tractor doing his job, lawfully going down the road, and a semi truck comes barreling down the road, Why the semi doesn't see him, nobody knows, but he barrels into him and he kills him. And that was just horrific. And I'll get to more about what we did with that case. The other one is this couple, and they get a call that the husband's father, who lives up north, was about to die, and he had been ill, and that they need to go up and give them their last wishes. So they get in the car, and they're driving up the highway, and a semi-truck barrels into the back of them and kills the husband.
On his way to see his father on his deathbed.
Yes.
Wow.
I mean, you hear about these fact patterns, and they come in, and you can't imagine that actually can happen, right? Mm-hmm. So the father had to get the call that his son wasn't going to come see him because his son had died. Mm-hmm. And I guess the father's last days were so much more horrific because of that, him knowing his son was dead. The other one is a young father. I'm a young father, and they were up north on a family vacation, and this vehicle was a commercial vehicle, blew a stop sign, and the kids were in the car, and the dad died. And I mean, these are things that they're too heavy to almost talk about. So when you think about what it means to represent these families, you then think about these horrible fact patterns, and then you have to think about what are their rights. And just to be clear about that, you can pursue a claim if it's in a traffic situation against the driver who caused the crash, the owner of the vehicle, and if they're employed, their employer. And the reality is that your right is against them, but in most of these cases, if there's a recovery, it comes from insurance coverage. So when you litigate these cases, the insurance coverage isn't something that gets to be talked about in court, but that's the reality of whether there's money to recover.
Well, let's talk about court for a minute. So you mentioned 3 different cases. Did all of them go to a jury trial?
A lot of personal injury cases settle before then because the people on the other side know that there is a very compelling case and that they don't want to have a jury decide how much should be paid. So those cases actually were litigated to some extent, but all 3 of them were resolved prior to trial in a favorable way to the clients. But money doesn't replace, but I will say that the representation of these families lets their story be told and gives them some type of compensation that's a token of their loss. It is not a one-for-one exchange ever, but at least is some type of recognition.
Does it help with closure?
I think it does. I think the process can be one the legal process can be one that almost like prevents closure for a little while, but once it happens and once they see that the representation has been, is meaningfully told their story and the loss of their loved one, they feel that was the right thing to do, and it does help them move on in life. That's the truth, It's not about money, but it's helping about moving on.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for helping these families and sharing how the Wrongful Death Act works for us.
Thank you.
In the Name of Personal Injury Law is brought to you by the Sinas Law Firm.